At 3:17 in the morning, the phone rang. Not from Paris, not from Washington, from the Kremlin itself. On the line was Vladimir Putin, speaking flawless French, a tongue he rarely uses in diplomacy. And what followed was a 47-minute exchange that rattled the very foundations of global power. Why would the master strategist of Moscow, a man who outplayed NATO and turned energy into a weapon, call a 35-year-old African revolutionary in the dead of night? What could possibly make the Kremlin admit weakness, not in public, but in a whisper across secure lines? This is not a rumor. This is not a headline. This is the story of how one conversation forced Russia to reconsider 20 years of strategy in Africa, and how it revealed a deeper truth the world is still struggling to face. Stay with us. This is more than a midnight phone call. It is a glimpse into history being rewritten. Subscribe and keep walking with us, because the question that began in Ouagadougou now echoes in every capital. If a small, landlocked nation can bend the ear of Moscow, what else might Africa achieve when it speaks with its own voice? 6 months before that midnight call, something unprecedented unfolded in West Africa. For the first time in 60 years, 3 nations, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, expelled foreign military bases at the same moment. Not phased withdrawals, not half measures, a clean break. The dust rising from abandoned barracks became the signal of a continent awakening. This was not the usual exchange of flags, where French troops exit only to be replaced by Russian advisors, or where Western dependency is traded for Eastern dependency. No, this was different. For the first time, African soil was defended not by outsiders, but by Africans themselves, bound by their own alliance. They called it the Alliance of Sahel States. But beneath the name lay something deeper. The first shoots of sovereignty in generations. Think of it. For 6 decades, decisions about security were made in Paris, Washington, or Moscow. The people of Ouagadougou, Bamako, Niamey, their skies filled with foreign planes, their streets shadowed by foreign uniforms. The script seemed unbreakable. Yet, in a single announcement, 3 governments turned the page. But sovereignty is not only about who guards the borders. It is also about who holds the keys to the nation's treasure. And so, in Ouagadougou, another declaration shook the financial order. Burkina Faso would no longer ship raw gold to foreign refineries. Instead, it would refine that gold on African soil with African hands for African markets. The numbers tell the story. For decades, Africa sold raw gold at $60 per gram. Abroad, that same gram was refined and sold back at $200. The difference, $140, was siphoned away. A silent theft repeated millions of times. When Traoré's government declared that the difference would remain at home, it was not simply economics. It was revolution. And what does revolution look like? It looks like furnaces built not by French contractors, nor by Russian engineers, but by African partnerships. It looks like workers in dusty towns turning ore into wealth without waiting for approval from Europe or Asia. It looks like children learning in schools funded by profits that once vanished overseas. The Kremlin had been watching. For 2 decades, Russia's Africa strategy was simple. Wait for frustration with the West, then step in with Russian alternatives. Russian weapons, Russian advisors, Russian protection. Always Russian control. But here was something unexpected. A new script, authored in Ouagadougou, in Bamako, in Niamey. A script that said Africa could build security without Moscow, prosperity without Paris, independence without Washington. In the Kremlin's intelligence reports, the words used were unpredictable, unprecedented, unsettling. Moscow had planned for African discontent. It had never planned for African design. And then came the announcement that turned unease into alarm. When Burkina Faso declared it would build refineries without foreign expertise, without Russian, Chinese, or Western technology, and would instead partner with African American engineers and investors, the rules of the game shifted. This was not the old dance of dependency. This was bloodlines reuniting, heritage returning, a diaspora answering the call of the mother continent. For Moscow, it was incomprehensible. For Paris, it was infuriating. For Washington, it was intriguing. But for Africans, it was dignity reborn. Picture the scene. In a modest laboratory in Ouagadougou, an African-American software engineer installs secure telecommunication systems, more advanced than those sold by Russia. In a dusty Sahel village, a renewable energy expert from Atlanta supervises solar panels that outperform European imports. In a small hospital, a surgeon of African descent designs medical training that rivals Moscow's own institutions. The soil of Africa was no longer yielding its fruits to others. It was nurturing its own harvest, watered by hands across oceans, guided by minds that shared both heritage and hope. And this is, more than the expulsion of soldiers, more than the refining of gold, is what rattled Moscow's confidence. The danger was not that Africa had rejected Russia. The danger was that Africa had learned it did not need Russia at all. That truth is what landed on Putin's desk in a single, chilling sentence from his intelligence services. If this African-American alliance succeeds, Russia will lose Africa without a single shot fired. But what exactly did Putin fear most? The gold, the alliances, or the people behind them? The answer to that question is what made him pick up the phone at 3:17 in the morning and dial Ouagadougou himself. When the Kremlin decided to act, it was not through tanks, sanctions, or ultimatums. It was through a phone call. At 3:17 in the morning, the leader who had stared down NATO, who had maneuvered wars and pipelines like chess pieces, reached across continents and spoke in a language he seldom used, French. "President Traoré," he began. But what followed was not the confidence of a conqueror. It was hesitation wrapped in courtesy. He offered what he had always offered African leaders: Russian expertise, Russian protection, Russian partnership. In Moscow, it was the standard package, influence dressed as assistance. But in Ouagadougou, the script had changed. Traoré did not respond with gratitude or negotiation. He responded with a mirror. "With respect, Russia has been in Africa for 20 years, he said, and you are still fighting for influence with France and America. We have been truly independent for 18 months, and we are already achieving results your experts said were impossible. Perhaps you should be asking what Russia can learn from Africa." Then came the silence, not seconds. Half a minute, then more. 37 seconds of a Kremlin stunned into wordlessness. Imjinit, a man known for quick, sharp replies, who had disarmed presidents and generals with icy precision, suddenly pausing, as though history itself had frozen. That silence was the sound of the old order cracking. When Putin spoke again, his tone was different. Gone was the patronizing air of a tutor addressing a pupil. What came instead was curiosity, edged with uncertainty. "President Traoré," he asked slowly, "what exactly are you building in Africa?" And so began a dialogue that exposed more than any summit ever could. The backdrop to this midnight drama was not only military expulsions or gold refineries. It was the presence of African Americans, engineers, doctors, entrepreneurs, whose contributions defied the Kremlin's assumptions. For Russian analysts, this was the true puzzle. How could a landlocked nation with scarce resources achieve breakthroughs that Moscow itself struggled to deliver? The reports had been blunt. Marcus Johnson, the software engineer, created telecommunications networks more secure than Russian systems. Quesa Williams, the renewable energy specialist, designed power grids that outperformed Moscow's own regional projects. Michael Thompson, the cardiovascular surgeon, built medical programs so attractive that students chose Ouagadougou over Moscow. What unnerved Russia most was not their skill alone, but their motive. They were not demanding concessions, contracts, or control. They were coming home, home to Africa, to heritage, to belonging. In Moscow's cold calculations, there was no algorithm for this. The people of Burkina Faso saw the difference. For decades, foreign assistance had arrived with conditions attached: bases to be built, votes to be secured, resources to be extracted. But the diaspora came with open hands, not clenched fists. Their presence ignited a quiet pride. Villages, once overlooked, now hosted projects that rivaled European technology. Hospitals once underfunded became centers of excellence. The message spread. Africa was no longer waiting for help. Africa was building with its own extended family. International media began to take notice. Western outlets framed it as a challenge to traditional diplomacy. African outlets hailed it as the beginning of a renaissance. Russian commentators, however, betrayed unease. If African Americans could empower African nations without Moscow's blessing, what use was the Kremlin's decades of investment? On the streets of Ouagadougou, the atmosphere was different. Markets buzzed, not only with goods, but with stories. We refined our own gold, traders told one another. We built our own systems. The sense of pride was not abstract. It was lived. Young men and women saw futures that no longer required migration or dependency. The narrative of weakness had been broken. This was the high point of the drama, where geopolitics collided with human dignity, where strategy yielded to symbolism. Putin, the master strategist, confronted a reality he had never faced: that Africa's strength might come not from alliances with Moscow, but from the bonds of its own scattered family. The cliffhanger of this moment was not only the question Putin asked, "What exactly are you building?" but the one he dared not voice. If Africa could achieve this, what stopped others from doing the same? What if Latin America, Asia, or even Russian diasporas followed the same path? That was the fear whispering behind the Kremlin's silence. A fear so great it turned a phone call into history. The possibility that dependency itself was dying. The reverberations of that midnight call were not limited to the Kremlin's corridors. They were felt in the streets of Ouagadougou, in the classrooms of Bobo Dioulasso, and in the dusty markets stretching across the Sahel. In the short term, the impact was tangible. When gold was refined locally, jobs multiplied. Smelters needed technicians, transporters, accountants, and traders. Small workshops sprang up around the larger refineries, supplying tools, uniforms, and services. What had once been a stream of wealth flowing outward became a river nourishing the land itself. Parents who once doubted the future now spoke of opportunities for their children, not in Paris, not in Moscow, but at home. Healthcare, too, bore fruit. The programs initiated with diaspora doctors attracted students from across West Africa. Hospitals that had been mere way stations for the sick began to transform into centers of research and learning. A young nurse in Ouagadougou described it best: "We are no longer only treating illness, we are training healers." Energy independence offered another immediate relief. With renewable grids designed in partnership with African American engineers, Villages long plunged into darkness, at night, began to glow. The hum of electric fans, the light of evening study lamps, the steady buzz of clinics powered by solar fields. These were the quiet revolutions that no headline captured but every citizen felt. Politically, the atmosphere shifted. Traoré's government, once dismissed by foreign commentators as a fragile military junta, began to command legitimacy, not because of speeches, but because of results. When citizens saw promises fulfilled, electricity supplied, medicine available, jobs created, skepticism gave way to trust. Sovereignty was no longer an abstract concept debated in international forums. It was food on the table, light in the home, dignity in daily life. In the medium term, the ripple effects grew wider. The Sahel alliance of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger began to solidify. What had started as a defensive pact turned into an economic dialogue. Could they share refinery capacity? Could they create joint energy corridors? Could they harmonize educational exchanges? Suddenly, the question was not whether they could survive without France or Russia, but how they might thrive together as equals. This marked a turning point in how citizens perceived their place in history. For decades, textbooks told a story of dependence. Africa as a continent waiting for aid, waiting for instruction, waiting for permission. Now, a different narrative was taking root. Africa as the architect of its own destiny. But with hope came unease. Foreign investors, accustomed to favorable terms, began to retreat, warning of instability. Media outlets in Europe predicted economic collapse, painting the reforms as reckless experiments. Yet on the ground, the opposite sentiment prevailed. Pride outweighed fear. Citizens echoed a simple refrain: better to stumble on our own feet than to crawl under foreign command. This sentiment is central to what many now call the Ibrahim Traoré Legacy. It is not only the gold or the energy or the hospitals. It is the psychological emancipation, the shift from resignation to ownership. In cafes, markets, and classrooms, conversations changed. The old question, who will save us, gave way to a new one. What can we build together? Yet these transformations also carried risks. By rejecting external dependency, Burkina Faso risked isolation. By choosing local refining, it risked retaliation from powerful commodity markets. By aligning with diaspora partners instead of global powers, it risked standing alone in times of crisis. Sovereignty, after all, is not a shield against hardship. It is a decision to face hardship on one's own terms. Still, the people understood the stakes. One farmer captured it in a proverb: better a rough harvest from your own soil than a banquet from another's field. This was more than pride. It was a new political ethic, one in which leaders would be judged not by foreign approval, but by domestic results. The transformation was not without its critics. Even within Burkina Faso, opposition voices questioned whether diaspora partnerships could truly sustain such ambitions. Some feared a new form of dependency in different clothing. Others asked whether the reforms were moving too fast, risking overextension. Yet even these critics acknowledged a fundamental shift. The country was no longer defined by external dictates, but by internal debate. That, in itself, was a form of independence. And so, in the months following that 3 a.m. call, the nation stood at a crossroads, proud of its gains, wary of its risks, but determined to continue forward. The legacy was already being written, not in treaties or speeches, but in everyday lives. Yet even as the people of Burkina Faso embraced their new path, the world beyond its borders was stirring. What would be the response of great powers unaccustomed to an Africa that no longer asked for permission. What happened after that 3 a.m. call was not confined to Ouagadougou or the Sahel. It reverberated through Moscow, Washington, Beijing, and Brussels, each capital forced to rethink assumptions it had carried for decades. In Moscow, the shock was immediate. Within days, Putin convened an emergency meeting with his top Africa advisors. For 2 decades, Russia's policy had been predictable: position itself as the alternative to Western neglect, offering military bases, mining contracts, and political backing in exchange for influence. But the reports from Burkina Faso challenged every premise. If a small landlocked country could refine its own gold, secure its own networks, and attract diaspora expertise without dependency, then Russia's leverage was at risk of collapsing. The Kremlin's pivot was swift but telling. 2 weeks later, Russia announced a shift in its Africa engagement. Instead of military bases and extraction deals, it began proposing technology partnerships, educational exchanges, and respect for African decision-making. The irony was striking. Russia, a nation that had long preached sovereignty while practicing control, was now compelled to echo the very language it once dismissed. In Washington, the reaction was more nuanced. American policymakers recognized the role of African Americans in the transformation. For years, diaspora engagement had been framed as cultural or symbolic. Now, it was delivering results that surpassed billion-dollar aid packages. Strategists in Washington began to ask whether the United States' greatest soft power tool in Africa might not be military or financial, but the talent and loyalty of its own diaspora communities. China's response was one of confusion. Beijing had invested heavily in Africa: roads, railways, stadiums, ports. Yet despite pouring billions into infrastructure, its influence seemed fragile compared to the relatively modest but deeply rooted diaspora partnerships. Chinese analysts studied the Sahel case closely, asking why cultural connection outperformed financial might. Some began to worry. If African nations preferred cooperation with their extended family abroad, China's massive investments could yield diminishing returns. Europe's dilemma was the most personal. For centuries, European nations framed themselves as Africa's natural partners, citing history, language, and trade. But that very history of exploitation, colonization, and resource extraction now worked against them. European leaders faced the uncomfortable truth that family ties between Africans and the diaspora outweighed old colonial links. The special relationship was no longer special. Across all these responses lay a common theme: the fear that Africa was slipping out of familiar categories, no longer dependent, no longer predictable, no longer manageable. Instead, Africa was presenting itself as a teacher, not a pupil, a force that could inspire new models rather than absorb old ones. For the Burkinabe leadership, this global shift was confirmation that the struggle was not only about today's sovereignty, but tomorrow's vision. As Traoré himself described it, the goal was not just to survive external pressure, but to build a future bold enough to inspire the continent. A phrase began circulating among his advisors: Ibrahim Traoré Vision 2050. It symbolized not a single plan, but a long horizon of universities that could rival the West, industries that could compete globally, and a society that stood proudly on its own foundations. Yet even as global powers recalibrated, one question lingered: would Africa's new path endure the storms of geopolitics? Or would external forces find new ways to pull it back into dependency? The question Putin asked at the end of that midnight call still echoes. What are you going to do next? For Traoré and the people of Burkina Faso, the answer was not whispered. It was declared. The vision was bold. Within 2 years, expand the diaspora partnership to 30 African countries. Build universities that draw global talent, not because they mimic Oxford or Sorbonne, but because they combine cutting-edge science with African traditions. Foster companies that do not merely compete by copying Western models, but pioneer uniquely African solutions to global challenges. In the Sahel, this vision looked like renewable energy corridors lighting up villages once dependent on diesel. It looked like cross-border healthcare systems where doctors trained in Ouagadougou operated seamlessly in Bamako and Niamey. It looked like joint defense initiatives, not anchored in foreign bases, but in African solidarity. But perhaps the most profound path forward lies in psychology. For centuries, Africa has been framed as a continent in need of saviors, of donors, of protectors. The future being built today rejects that narrative. It reframes Africa not as a problem to be solved, but as a teacher, a builder, a contributor to global civilization. The risks are real. External powers will not simply watch as their influence wanes. Economic sanctions, political pressure, even covert destabilization remain possible tools. The challenge will be to maintain unity under pressure, for history shows that Africa's greatest vulnerability has not been external strength, but internal division. That is why the bridge to the diaspora is so crucial. It is more than technical expertise. It is a reminder that Africa is not alone. 50 million African Americans with 1.6 trillion in spending power, united with 1.3 billion Africans, create not just an economic force, but a cultural renaissance. It is the long road of 400 years being crossed in a single generation. For young Africans, the path ahead means daring to imagine futures beyond survival. Futures of innovation, pride, and global respect. For older generations, it means witnessing promises long deferred finally begin to materialize. And for the diaspora, it means answering a call across oceans, not as outsiders, but as family, returning to build together. The true test will not be whether Burkina Faso can stand alone, but whether Africa can stand united. For unity is the only force stronger than dependency, the only shield against manipulation, the only road to a dignity that cannot be bought or borrowed. Yet as this new journey begins, the world is watching closely. Will Africa's renaissance be allowed to flourish? Or will old powers return with new strategies to keep the continent chained? The answer lies in the steps taken from this moment forward. At 3:17 in the morning, the world witnessed more than a phone call. It witnessed a glimpse of tomorrow, a Kremlin shaken, an African leader unbowed, and a continent daring to imagine itself not as a pawn, but as a player in the game of global power. The legacy of that conversation is already clear. It showed that power does not flow only from armies or treaties, but from dignity, unity, and vision. When gold is refined at home, when hospitals train their own doctors, when energy grids light up villages without foreign permission, sovereignty stops being a slogan and becomes a lived reality. This is the essence of the Ibrahim Traoré legacy. It is not just about Burkina Faso's choices, but about a wider awakening across Africa. The rediscovery that true independence is not given, it is built. It is hammered in furnaces, taught in classrooms, harvested in fields, and defended in alliances forged on African terms. But a legacy is only the foundation. The horizon stretches further. To speak of the future is to speak of a continent unchained, reaching towards a bold horizon, a vision that some now call the Ibrahim Traoré Vision 2050. It is the dream of universities where African and diaspora minds create knowledge that changes the world. It is the rise of African enterprises that compete not by imitation, but by innovation. It is a society where the measure of success is not approval abroad, but pride at home. The question remains, if one small landlocked nation can force the Kremlin to rethink, what might an entire continent achieve when it walks as one? For centuries, Africa has been told to wait, for aid, for partners, for permission. But the call at 3 a.m. was proof that the waiting is over. The world no longer looks at Africa as a question mark. It looks at Africa as an answer. If this resonates with your sense of justice, do not look away. Subscribe, share, and comment, because history is not waiting. It is being written. And together, we are part of the pen. The Ibrahim Traoré legacy is already unfolding. The real question is how far, how fast, and how fiercely this vision will reshape the future.